Days. Before we get started, let me just quickly remind you what Elevation Days is all about. First of all, it is one of the only group events that mobilize and is offered to all the company's employees, whether they are in the production sites in France, in subsidiaries, in India, in Brazil, in the United States, everywhere in the group. The Elevation Days is a moment dedicated to sustainable development, the circular economy, ethics, working conditions. It is organized by and for the company's employees. It's an event to raise awareness, raise consciousness, and place CSR at the heart of each business. And above all, Elevation Days aims to give everyone the keys, the understanding, the perspective to take the step to transform the business and the way in which it adds value to the company. And this year, it is the 8th edition. Before giving the floor to Coralie Aubin, a final word to tell you that this conference will be recorded and will be available for replay in the intranet. And finally, do not hesitate to ask your question via the chat. There will be a Q&A session at the end of this webinar. So Coralie, I let you present in detail what our colleagues will discover today.
Thank you, Robin. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. So last week, during the first webinar, we presented with OpenLand the 5 elements of the natural capital, which are water, air, earth, fire, and life. We presented the many challenges for companies, but also the many solutions that are available to us. So today, we will focus on air, and more specifically on greenhouse gas emissions. The aim today is to share with you one of the priorities of the CSR roadmap, the low carbon trajectory pillar. So there are 3 main reasons for this. First, the fight against climate change is now a global concern based on scientific evidence, where states, citizens, companies are fighting together. And Manitou Group has decided to join this global effort. We have been involved in the EcoAct project since March with the support of EcoAct experts and the expert that will be here today with us presenting this webinar. Secondly, the significant commitment of states, cities, and companies to reduce their own emissions is generating new demands for low carbon products and services. This becomes an element of competitiveness and an opportunity for the group to conquer new market shares. And third, not a week goes by without us receiving a questionnaire, whether it's from customers or from investors, asking us about our emissions and the actions we carry out to limit global warming. Organizations, including Manitou Group, are going to be increasingly held accountable for their emissions, and this is going to increase dramatically over the next 10 years. So this is a major reputational issue. Today, we are currently finalizing our climate commitments. It is therefore important that each one of you take up these structural and transformative issues. And to lead this webinar, we welcome Florentin Cail, a climate and energy consultant at EcoAct. Florentin, you have the floor.
Yep. Hi, everyone. Thank you to be here today. So first of all, we'll talk today about the low carbon trajectory of Manitou Group and why is the group committed. In order to sum up the elements that we will see today, we will start with the climate general context and then why it is important to think about this context in the perception of Manitou Groups. We'll see why the commitment of Manitou Group is now a concern for every part in Manitou. We'll focus on some key elements of the carbon footprint of Manitou Group and see how this can be translated in SBT commitment, science-based target commitment. We'll focus just after on examples of reduction action, and finally we'll conclude these presentations and take your questions. First of all, let's talk about the context, and let's talk about climate change, which is a major concern of at the present time. So to understand the climate change, you have to understand that the Earth atmosphere is made up of different greenhouse gases that you can see here. And these gases help at maintaining a certain temperature on the planet and thus support life. This atmospheric composition has been modified by human activities. That's why we have an additional greenhouse effect that has been set up among Earth. These additional greenhouse effects leads to climate change, and we can see all over the world. We'll see in a couple of slides how these effects can be seen on Earth. And this climate change leads to disruption of natural exchanges, and because of these disruptions, we have a modification of the atmospheric compositions, and then we have a cycle effect, which is worse and worse. In order to imagine the projection of climate change, you can see the following graph, which highlights the fact that if we do nothing, IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, highlighted the fact that if we do nothing at the present time, the increase of temperature could reach 5 degrees C by 2100. In order to see how this kind of temperature modification can be a catastrophe for the Earth and for us, you can imagine that at our temperature plus 8 degrees C, we had dinosaurs at the North Pole 60 million years ago, and at the average temperature minus 5 degrees C, we had penguins in Marseille 20,000 years ago. So it's in order to understand how change in temperature can be dreadful. As you all know, we have impacts that are more and more violent, but also which occurs at a fast pace. It occurs globally, of course. In 2019, we had the second hottest recorded year globally. We also had really violent fires that were really hard to keep in control in Australia, Brazil, USA. Acidification of oceans. When I talked about the cycle of the climate change, this is a good example of it, because with corals dying, we have less and less CO2 captured, and then we have an intensification of the effect. We also have really violent floods in Japan and in India, and in France, we had in the Pic du Midi 108 days without negative temperature. In order to try to face this climate disaster, we have an international awareness globally. So it started in 2014 with the Climate Summit with 100 heads of state in New York. The aim of this event was to try to achieve a resilient, carbon neutral world by the end of the century. We had also another couple of events. I won't mention all of them, but we have to highlight maybe the Paris Agreement in 2015 with the COP21. The aim of it was to stay below 1.5 or below 2 degrees C by the end of the century. In 2017 as well, the European Commission's roadmap was declared, and the final aim of it was to try to declare the objective in order to have a zero carbon economy by 2050. And finally, in 2018 in France, the carbon neutrality objectives were declared. This concept of carbon neutrality is more and more developed globally. We have 3 different kinds of commitments which are done by the countries. Either they are declaring some commitment in the law, or they are politically speaking, or finally, you can just declare a project law. So in the law, we have the following examples. They are almost all committed for 2050, except for Sweden, which declared carbon neutrality for 2045. Political commitment with China and Japan, and project law with these following countries. And we can highlight the return of United States of America back to the Paris Agreement. So in fact, Trump exited this agreement, and Biden, after his election, just signed back the Paris Agreement. So as you can see, globally speaking, there is a real commitment about carbon neutrality. If we focus on a more precise scale, we can see that there is also a commitment among cities. And this is an example of a commitment among cities. C40 is a network of global megacities which try to collaborate together and share knowledge in order to fight against climate change and to live in a more sustainable way of life. So we can notice here that even if the United States were not anymore on the Paris Agreement before 2021, they succeed in develop the commitment among C40 initiative. We also have the role of companies, which is really, really important, globally speaking. They try to follow this scheme. First of all, they measure and they assess their global carbon footprint, greenhouse gases footprint. Secondly, with this measurement, they can do it with bilan carbon methodology, which is a French methodology, or we can use the greenhouse gas protocol, which was used by Manitou in the Manitou Group's climate project in order to measure the greenhouse gas emissions. After measuring and assess these, the global carbon footprint of the group, some incentives are set up in order to try to find ways of reducing emissions on the global greenhouse gases emissions. In order to do so, we have the Science-Based Targets initiative, which has been put in place a couple of years ago, and which was used in this study in order to find ways of reducing the global emissions of the group, of the Manitou Group. And only after these two steps, we have we can develop offsetting way of treating the remaining emissions. I insist on the fact that it has to be done with the remaining ones. The two steps, measure and reduce, have to be done to the global emissions. And finally, only finally, you can compensate the remaining ones that can't be tackled with reduction actions. And you can use the offset phenomenon in order to be carbon neutral. So you have a couple of standards here to respect the offset program. So after presenting this, the global context, we can talk about the commitment of the group, the Manitou Group. So what we have to understand is, as we see all together, we have climate change effects that are more and more impactful all over the world. These impacts has been highlighted and oblige countries to commit themselves in order to face the issues that we have to face. As a consequence, cities and activities sectors will try to follow guidelines set up by countries. And because of the involvement of the countries, the cities, and the sectors such as constructions and agriculture, Manitou Group has to commit in order to stay competitive. So we can say that this commitment is a must-have for Manitou Group in order to remain in the race and to drive the green transition. Yeah, I will let Coralie present this.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. So as you can see, the construction industry, including the rental sector, is all following the same trend by committing itself to the development of a more sustainable energy policy. And here we can see a focus on our competition, who all got. Sorry, Florentin, you stopped sharing your screen.
Yeah, it's shut, but I don't know why. Sorry. Yeah. So is it okay for now? Okay.
It's downloading. Okay, that's fine. Thank you. So yes, so as you can see here, our competitors have all. I mean, most of them have had a low carbon trajectory validated with the science-based target initiatives. So it means that it has been validated by scientific evidence that it was in line with either a 1.5 Celsius degree trajectory or 2 degrees Celsius trajectory. So for example, we have a Volvo Group who has a trajectory of 1.5 degrees Celsius. And then Komatsu and Itachi, who are on a pathway to 2 degrees Celsius. And then more recently, JCB and Eugenrich are in the validation process with the science-based targets. So it's key for us to stay competitive, to take that path also. And it's also, of course, a way to avoid talent drain, to be a company seen as innovative, because citizens and talents we are recruiting are also sensitive to this kind of a concern. Thank you. So more on the side of our customers and clients. So we have, for example, Loxam in the rental sector, who announced that it's cutting its direct emission by 50%. So it's related to the buildings and energy, and its indirect emissions, which is related to their products, to what they sell, indirect emissions by 30% compared to 2019. Another example in that sector is with Kilutu, rental as well, who made the choice to go towards alternative energy equipment. For example, as of today in France, 30% of their equipment run on more responsible energy source, such as hybrid, dual energy, electric, and stage 5. In the USA, United Rental is calling its suppliers to share their commitment addressing the challenges of climate change and their work to protect the environment. So we can see that there is a lot of commitments on our clients on this side. The next example with Eiffage, who is also building a partnership with Volvo Trucks to develop 100% electric vehicles to put into service. And then we have Colas in the construction sector as well, who is moving also towards low carbon solutions. It can be green hydrogen as well, biogas. And the last example with more recent with Coates in the rental sector as well in Australia, whose group has announced that they want to achieve a net zero emission by 2040. So it's very ambitious on the customer demand.
So thank you, Coralie. So after seeing that there is a fierce competition concerning the commitment of other companies other than Manitou Group, we can highlight the fact that the two sectors where Manitou Group is involved, such as construction and agriculture markets, have to be highlighted. And we have, first of all, for the construction market, an important shift that has to be pointed out. In fact, building sectors represent 6% of global emissions, globally speaking, according to the IPCC. And we have different incentives towards a demand for more sustainable ways and more sustainable practices among this sector. For example, we have the first example highlights the fact that we have demand that is developed in order to have zero emissions machines. And we have the key trigger is the fact that it presents a benefit to the wider construction sector, but also for the communities and the citizens. So we have a double effect. Secondly, the example of the City of London with the raise of awareness that they wanted to increase the way of living of people living there. So as a consequences, they wanted to retrofit or replace old and polluting machinery to develop more sustainable way and more sustainable machinery. A third example is the fact that we have some incentives and helps in order to try to reduce and to renew the fleets used in order to construct buildings. The way adopted by incentives is to cancel and to avoid non-road diesel equipments and try to develop more sustainable equipments. And finally, a report of the ADEME, which is the French agency about transition, which highlights the fact that using sustainable equipments such as electric or battery-powered equipments can decrease the local pollutants and increase the level of standard of people. The second major activity sector for Manitou is the agricultural one. We have in this sector emerging signals, but this sector is much harder to pin down than the construction sector because we have some incentives, but market is hard to think, and it is hard to think about ways of evolution of this market. We have a first example of shift, which is the fact that the agricultural sector, globally speaking, is facing the issues that it can meet nowadays. We have a second example with the new PAC agreement, the EU Common Agri Policy, which is aligned with the Green Deal issued by the European Union Commission, and which aim at fighting the climate change and try to reach zero net emissions by 2050. And the third example is an example taken from a McKinsey and Company report, which says that even if the market is not as advanced than the consumer vehicles one, we have some proofs of concept and prototypes are developed, and as a consequences, we have some equipments that are ready to change and to be switched towards more sustainable equipments. So after seeing that we have lots of pressures, either by the companies that are represent fierce competition for Manitou or by cities and countries, we can now focus on the work that we started in March, which is the Manitou carbon footprint. So first of all, when we talk about carbon footprint, we have to understand what we measure. You have to understand that the measurement is done through 3 scopes. The first scope represents the direct emissions linked with the consumption of energy. More precisely, you have to consider the company facilities with the energy consumptions linked with the heating, the cooling of the atmosphere, but also the consumptions of all the fuels that can happen in the company. You also have the assessment of the company vehicles' energy consumption as well, that are the property of Group Manitou. This is for the first scope. Secondly, you have the scope 2, the second scope, which depicts the indirect emissions linked with the energy consumption. So it's directly linked with the first scope because it takes the same consumptions, but only for the indirect part. So you will focus on purchased electricity, steam, heating, and cooling for own use. If you want to understand well, you can think about a sphere that is englobing Manitou's group. All the emissions that are in the sphere, the direct sphere of Manitou Group, will be in the first scope, whereas second scope will measure the emissions linked with energy that are indirect and out of this direct sphere of Manitou. And finally, you have the scope 3, which is the main one, as you will see just after, which can be secluded into two parts. The first one with the upstream emissions. So you will have all the goods, the purchased goods and services, the business travel, all the categories that happen in upstream point of view for Manitou Group. And you also have a second part for scope 3, which is the downstream emissions. And you will assess all the flows that are starting from Manitou's group towards the other environment. So after defining the three scopes, I wanted to point out the methodology used in this study. So first of all, we focused on all the perimeter that was measured. So we relied on the teams of Manitou groups, and I really want to thank you all the Manitou groups team, because it was a really huge work. We just extract some couple of data here, as you can see. So in the climate project, there was more than 13,000 lines of data gathered and many different collections files in order to refine the measurement and to be as accurate as possible. And almost 2,040 hours spent only on the Manitou Group's side on this project. So after all this consequent work done by the Manitou Group's teamworks, we use the gathered data in order to assess the global greenhouse gases emissions by using emissions factors given most of the time by the ADEME, which is again the agency about transition in France. After doing all the calculations for the greenhouse gases emissions, we have secluded these emissions thanks to their origin. Either it is in use of sold products, in inputs, capital goods, etc., in order to try to find the hotspots and to find triggers in order to reduce the assessment of the emissions, which is the fourth step. It is to try to have a scheme of different actions that aim at reducing the emissions. For the gas measures, we focused on the 7 gas below. So as you can see that their impacts on climate change is really dependable on their nature. And we focus on the global warming potential for at 100 years. And just to know, you have to compare all of the greenhouse gases thanks to their global warming potentials. And the reference is fixed as 1 for the carbon dioxide. So we'll only talk about ton equivalent CO2, but all of the following gas are taken into account in this study. So here's the assessment of the Group Manitou for 2019. First of all, we can focus on the scopes, which is highlighted in the first graph, and you can see that the scope 3 is the major one with more than 99% of the emissions. Then we can notice that for the scopes 1 and 2, we have most of the emissions are explained by energy category, and for the scope 3, we have mainly the category use of sold products taken into account. That represents almost 90% of the emissions for scope 3. A really important remark that can be done here is the fact that scopes 1 and 2 focus on year 2019. However, for the scope 3, it is the same reporting year, but for use of sold products, we will focus on all equipments that are sold in 2019, but we will take into account all of the emissions that are emitted during all the life cycle of the machines sold in 2019. That's why this category completely explode the general the global emissions. And finally, scopes 1 and 2 have to be highlighted, even if they are really really minor, because SBT initiative sets targets on these 2 scopes. We will now focus on main emission sources of the group. So we have, first of all, the use of sold products equipments. We highlighted the analysis with spare parts excluded here. So as you can see, there is a major of units that is composed of diesel equipment, which can be highlighted also in the consumptions of the equipments. And as a consequence, you have 99% of the emissions that are diesel is responsible of 99% of these emissions for this category. Secondly, we have the purchased goods and services. It accounts for almost 10% of Manitou total emissions, and most of the emissions for this category comes from the equipment produced and the spare parts, for almost 94% of the emissions in this category. And for 6%, we have the emissions linked with services. And if we exclude the components for equipments, in this category, we only have almost 100% of services. We can also point out the freight category, which is a major one. We decided to focus on this presentation on the downstream freight, which is the major one. The thing that can be underlined here is the fact that the freight is done by, in terms of tons kilometer, is done by 70% by maritime freight, and only represent 22% of the emissions, globally speaking, for the downstream freight. Whereas the road freight represents 30% of tons kilometers, but 76% of the emissions. This can be explained with the differences of emissivities per type of transportations. You can see on this graph that maritime freight and road freight, maritime freight, sorry, is almost 8 times less emissive than the road freight. More than 8 times, actually. Then a quick focus on the energy part. For this category, we have a characterization of 53% of gas consumptions in terms of energy, in terms of energy consumption, but in terms of emissions, it represents 45%. And for electricity, 34% in total consumptions, and 40% of the emissions. So what can be highlighted from this carbon insight and for all the study, generally speaking, is the fact that scope 3 is the major scope of this global assessment. It represents more than 99% of the global carbon footprint. You also have 2 main categories in terms of emissions: use of sold products, which is 89% of the global carbon footprint, followed by inputs, which is 9%. And we can also pay attention on freight, which is also a major concern and source of emissions in Manitou groups. Finally, scope 3 can trigger a huge impact in terms of reduction emissions, because reduction actions put on the category of the scope 3 will have a huge impact, because the scope 3 by definition is huge in terms of emissions. Yet we have to bear in mind that scopes 1 and 2 have to be considered as well, because science-based initiatives requires reduction objectives on them. And just to keep in mind that energy is 1% of the global carbon footprint. So we saw that after in the 3 phases that you have, after assessing these emissions, you can try to set up some reduction actions, and initiatives such as SBT commitment aims at highlighting reduction actions. So just to give you the context about science-based targets initiatives, the aim of this initiative is to try to curb temperature rise among Earth, and it gives a chance to companies to be involved and to take real commitment based on science-based targets in order to try to keep their emissions as low as possible. So as we are driving to a more and more zero carbon economy, companies want to be involved, and they want to reduce their emissions. Just a quick overview of the commitment of companies for now. We have almost 2,000 companies that are taking actions thanks to the Science-Based Targets Initiative, with almost 1,000 science-based targets and almost 940 commitments to 1.5 degrees C. Here you have an example of a science-based target pathway. So in this graph, you can see that we start with a point here in 2019, about 7,000 tons equivalent CO2, and we will depict all of the lines that are here. The first one in orange is business as usual, so it does represent the level of emissions that are reached without any intervention, without any pressure on action reduction among the company. So that's why it is all the time increasing, except for 2020, which was affected, of course, by the COVID-19. You have also you have a second curve, which so the 3 remaining curves depicts scenarios where companies take action on reduction actions. So the first one in blue is a scenario of 2 degrees C. So we want to keep well below 2 degrees C the temperature at the end of the 21st century. So as a consequence, we try to implement linearly reduction actions in order to reduce, globally speaking, the emissions that are released every year. This is the same logic for the green scenario, the 1.5 degrees C. And finally, you have a last scenario, which is the physical intensity. In this scenario, you can notice that the emissions are kept at around 7,000 tons equivalent CO2, because in this scenario, you will consider an increase in sales. If we take, for example, the example of Manitou, you can take the increase in sales of the machines that will happen all over the years. So the emissions would increase all over the years. So in order to keep to maintain the level of emissions at the same level than in 2019, you will try to focus on the release of machinery, on the release of emissions by machinery. So if you decrease the instantaneous emission released by the machinery, and you increase the machinery sold, you can keep as a constant the level of emissions that you will have all over the years. Okay, I will just let Coralie present this slide.
Yes. Where are we at regarding this low carbon pathway? So we completed the first steps, which were to measure Manitou Group global carbon footprint, which Florentin gave you a summary of. Then we internally we identified the hotspots of Manitou Group carbon footprints, such as the use of sold products, such as freight, building energy, and inputs. And then we made some calculation of potential emissions avoided thanks to reduction actions. So we will present that slide later. And now, today, we are in the process of validation for the low carbon pathway. And it's after that that we will talk about implementing reduction actions and so on.
Thanks, Carly. So, as Carly mentioned, we worked on some couples of reduction actions, and here are some examples that could be implemented amongst Manitou Group. So here you have the emissions avoided for each of the actions that are calculated for 2030. So it is a potential of emissions avoided. So we will see the first action, which could be to promote the low emissions equipment, which is part of the scope 3 because it impacts the use of sold products category. So the aim would be to try to transfer traditional diesel engines to low carbon equipment, which relies on B30 fuel, B100 fuel, or which are composed by electric engines or hybrid engines. With such, here is the potential that could be avoided, the potential of emissions that could be avoided in 2030. Second actions would be to reduce air freight and to try to encourage the development of maritime freight and road freight instead of maritime freight and road freight instead of air freight. Sorry. The third one is to increase recycled materials in Manitou Group's equipments, which affect the inputs category. With, for example, the potential here relies on the increase of the steel recycled steel components among Manitou's equipments. And finally, you can act on the electricity scopes, the energy scopes, which are scopes 1 and 2, with the purchase of renewable energy certificates in order to, as a complement of the ISO 50001, to cover the emissions which are developed by energy categories. So to conclude and to finish these presentations, we have seen that the trigger for the group's involvement in the climate is the climate emergency in one way, marked by global warming, but also the pressures that can be the pressure that can happen to Manitou, in terms of sectors activities and also by other companies, because as you can see, competition is really important and is happening around Manitou.
Florentin, if you can switch to the last slide.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So just to finish on this presentation, we saw that we have the climate emergency that is happening right now, which triggers awareness among Manitou groups, which wanted to involve in this emergency. We analyzed all of the external pressure, as I said, with the competitions done by other companies and with the Manitou Group's business sectors. These two sources of pressure forces Manitou to pay attention on the carbon footprint in order to stay finally competitive on the market. And finally, here we are in the definition of Manitou Group's strategy with the measurement of the global carbon footprint, which permitted to highlight hotspots and try to find reduction action on them. And finally, the key is to define low carbon pathway on both scopes 1 and 2 and scope 3. So thanks to all of you for being here, for helping us to assess the carbon footprint again, and we can take any questions that you have right now.
Yes, thank you, Florentin. There was a lot of information in that presentation. So if now we can switch to the question and answer session. You can either use the chat. I don't think there has been any question in the chat box, or you can take the microphone if you want to ask questions. It's the best opportunity to do it now, because we have Florentin from EcoAct who can help us answer the questions you may have, either regarding the reduction actions or regarding the way, the methodology we applied to calculate the 2019 emissions, GHG emissions. So are there any questions? How is Manitou progressing in electric or hydrogen models? Thank you, Pierluigi, for these questions. Aude, do you want to answer this question?
Hello, everyone. So on the energy transition roadmap, we are working on it. As you know, on electric, some new products are launching very soon. We have today the MRT, and the new product will be launched in the coming years. On hydrogen, we have in the R&D and CSR roadmap the objective to have two prototypes to be ready on hydrogen for 2023.
Thank you for that answer, Aude. Are there any other questions? What percentage impact did the COVID-19 working from home, etc. lockdown have on the figures? Maybe Florentin, you want to answer that question. On our side, we realized the assessment on the year 2019 because we didn't want to take the year 2020 because of COVID-19. It impacted the production, of course, and the energy as well related to our facilities, like for example working from home. But maybe Florentin, you want to answer regarding the impact of working from home or lockdown regarding building facilities and so on.
Yeah, so maybe the first thing is that I can't have a precise percentage impact of the COVID-19 effects on the year 2020. I just take again the slide that showed that in this example of this company, for example, we have a decrease in the activity of the company. So it can affect your equipment sold. It can affect your production as well, because if you think you will sell less, you will produce less. But it's really hard to have a direct percentage because it depends on the sector activity. The only thing is the fact that, for example, SBT initiatives took this into account by saying that normally you have 2 years for the reference year that you want to take, and for your reduction actions, you have to calculate the emissions thanks to this reference year. Here, as 2020 was really affected, SBTi accepted to give a delay in order to have a reference year that is more far away than it was the case before. So yeah, it affects also the fact that people were remotely working instead of going to the offices. But I can't have an estimated percentage of the impact. Sorry.
Well, maybe just an estimation that we have at a global level on the COVID crisis impact. We know that emission decreased globally by 6 or 7% during 2020. And we know that to attain the reduction that we have to do to maintain the temperature below 2 degrees by the end of the century, this 6% or 7% per year is a reduction that normally we should do to attain this target.
Yes, thank you, Odin Florentin, for these answers. Then we have a question from Javier Ortega. Are you aligned with training to train technical teams after sales in new technologies, hybrid, hydrogen, lithium, and etc.? What do you want to answer?
I know that this is something that is today in progress, in discussion. So I can answer quite precisely to your question, but we know that this is something to be developed, to be pushed in the future. And I know that some teams, not in CSR, but are working on that.
Thank you. And another question from Wanda Cravero. Sorry for the pronunciation if I'm pronouncing it unwell. Is there a possibility of installing carbon measuring devices and VOC measuring devices at various Manitou factory sites around the world, specifically pertaining to spray booths and workshops? I know that on my side there are some devices regarding energy measuring devices for building facilities. I'm not aware, but again, I'm not maybe the most appropriate person to answer that. Regarding VOC measuring devices, we do measure VOC emissions in the operational sites where we have industrial operations, but we make the calculation based on the potential of VOC emissions, depending on whether it's solvents or a solvent-based paint or pure solvent used. But it's more based on internal calculations than on any devices. And are there possibilities to install carbon measuring devices in the building facilities? That is something that the group will be working on, maybe more specifically in the industrial sites where we, of course, consume more energy. And that is something that will be directly linked to one of the reduction action that is on the energy building, that could be linked to the ISO 50001, which is linked to the energy reduction. And to do that, we need to measure it precisely, building by building. So that could be linked to that in the coming years. Yes. Okay, so I think that was it for the questions, unless you have some more questions. So I think we okay. So I think we are ready to conclude. So I just wanted to remind you that we are in the validation phase of the low carbon trajectory. So like I said previously, it will be very transformative for the group. So it was important for us to have everyone on the same page because it can be quite technical or difficult, complex to comprehend as to why we are committing to a low carbon trajectory and what it will mean for the group, for our products and for our services. So stay tuned, because we will communicate on this in the coming weeks, so that from next year we can focus on the reduction actions. So that's something that you will know more about in the coming months as well. Thank you, Florentin and EcoAct for your support. And special thanks also, of course, to the teams who contributed to the ClimAct project. We will post the replay of the 2 webinars on the CSR Google site, which you can access via the intranet. And I invite you to share the replay to your teams to pass on the message. Thank you all, and have a great day.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Goodbye.